Our next speaker is Jane Buchanan, who is an independent human rights investigator, educator, and advocate. She worked as Human Rights Watch for 17 years, including as a deputy director for disability rights. During her 17-year career as a Human Rights Watch, she initiated organizational work in Ukraine in 2002 and conducted multiple investigations into human rights violations in 25 countries, including the armed. Thank you, Jane.
Great, thank you so much. So I just want to thank everyone, and I'm extremely honored to be here. And I come with a tremendous amount of humility in the face of the experience of Alexandra, Pavlo, and all of your compatriots, and obviously all of the essential and crucial work that you do. I was invited to give a bit of perspective on the situation for persons with disabilities in terms of this conflict. So I'll be in the human rights and humanitarian context for this particularly at-risk group. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to try to share my screen here with a few slides I've prepared. Okay, is that visible?
Yeah, it's up.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. Okay. So I'll just start with a little bit of framing here. So on the profile of people with disabilities in Ukraine. So human rights activists and persons with disabilities approach disability through the conceptualization that disability arises from physical, social, and attitudinal barriers in society that prevent people from enjoyment of all aspects of their life on an equal basis with others. So this is a bit different from approaching people with disabilities as those who should be managed, taken care of, or fixed. Disability and diversity of disability are a fundamental part of the human condition. And with that, I wanted to start my presentation by sharing this photo of a representative Ukrainian organization, a person with disabilities. Yura, he's a wheelchair user. He has been involved in the humanitarian response and the human rights response as a person with disabilities. I should also say that the work that I do and much of the work that's here, is really on the shoulders and through the amazing work of countless organizations and individuals with disabilities in Ukraine, persons who have fled Ukraine and working in other countries to defend the rights of persons with disabilities in Ukraine. But just a little bit of background, as of 2020, so prior to Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine in February of this year, there were an estimated 6 million people with disabilities in Ukraine. So these are people with sensory, physical, intellectual, and psychosocial disabilities, and those with multiple disabilities. Among them are many older people who have been very visible in this conflict. About 25% of Ukraine's population is older. We know that the prevalence of disability increases with age. The Ukrainian government has had policies and initiatives in place for many years to combat discrimination, increase accessibility, because we know that in all countries around the world, there remains stigma, discrimination, and lack of accessibility for people with disabilities in different spheres. Before I talk about the situation, in the recent months, is just to make note that obviously there's been ongoing conflict and occupation in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea since 2014, when Russia first invaded. The result has been death, injury, destruction, and widespread human rights abuses in those areas. At least 1.5 million people displaced from 2014 to 2022, and about 5% of them are persons with disabilities. All right, so Russian military attacks and disability. So this war, as our colleagues have said, has been characterized by deliberate Russian military bombing, missile, artillery, and other attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. This creates particular dangers for people with disabilities, and it also increases the prevalence of disability. So, for example, we have seen images of people taking refuge in or living in basements, metro stations, and other locations as seeking protection from bombing and other attacks. Unfortunately, these types of shelters are often not accessible to people with physical disabilities. In some cases, information about shelters may not be accessible for them and places them at greater risk than others who may be able to access shelters. So an unknown number, but surely in the tens, hundreds of thousands have been badly injured, including with the loss of limbs, hearing, sight, or burns by bombs, missiles, and other weapons. Others have been harmed by attacks, direct attacks, violence, sexual violence, and torture by Russian forces occupying parts of Ukraine. And the lasting and psychosocial harm of these abuses, as well as uncertainty about the future and the lack of access to basic necessities, is also a grave concern, and it increases as the war goes on. So in the light of the attacks on medical facilities, medical infrastructure, medical personnel, and doctors, it raises concerns about the long-term consequence for people with disabilities and people with newly acquired disabilities. So particularly brutal in this war, as Pablo mentioned, has been the Russian military's use of certain types of weapons, their regular and consistent use, including cluster munitions. We heard from Pablo the impact of those munitions and their indiscriminate nature. One of the other features of them is that if they don't explode upon impact, they effectively become landmines, which can explode on contact or indiscriminately. Russian forces have also regularly used other types of weapons that are banned. These are anti-personnel landmines, anti-vehicle landmines, both of which that can kill and lead to serious bodily injury. Russian forces have also placed victim-activated booby traps in homes, yards, roads, and agricultural areas when withdrawing from occupied areas. When people touch these or when they explode indiscriminately, this results in death and serious injury. In light of the conflict and the attacks and the nature of the attacks, there have been a lot of people who have sought to evacuate and have been forced to flee their homes for their own lives and safety and that of their families. So in addition to what Mark shared at the beginning, the current UN data estimates that a total of at least 13 million people in Ukraine have fled their homes. About half have fled Ukraine to other countries where they have sought refuge. The other half are displaced in other parts of Ukraine. The need for evacuation is ongoing. Most recently, we know that the Ukrainian government has called on people to evacuate parts of eastern Ukraine. These calls for evacuation have been ongoing when there's known escalation in conflict, and evacuations are underway. Many people are able to flee on their own or through government or other organized evacuation systems. However, people with disabilities may face particular barriers. In some cases, they cannot independently reach train or bus stations or collective sites for evacuation. They require support services to get them there. Information may not be accessible for people with different types of disabilities or for people who may not have access to or utilize phones or the internet. So here I just have a few images from the Ukrainian Disability Rights Organization. It's an organization of persons with disabilities, women-led organization who do evacuations. Here they're evacuating people with specialized transport, including a person who needed to be evacuated lying down. I'll just also mention the situation of residential institutions. Unfortunately, large numbers of children and adults do continue to live in residential institutions for persons with disabilities, particularly in the East. It's a legacy of the Soviet Union. And these present particular challenges for evacuations because some of those institutions are quite large with several hundred people in them. Now for the situation for people who are unable to or choose not to flee. People who remain in insecure areas may not be able to access food, water, medicines, or healthcare regularly or at all. Other items in humanitarian parlance, these are non-food items. These are things for persons with disabilities that are essential for their dignity, their health and well-being, such as adult diapers or incontinence pads. These are in short supply and are desperately needed. Many people who have fled or in different experiences of the conflict have lost or had their assistive products damaged. These include wheelchairs, walkers, hearing aids, and glasses. I want to note that in many of these areas where people with disabilities or others who remain in insecure areas, unable to evacuate, may not be able to access essentials. There are extremely dynamic, brave volunteer networks and smaller organizations who are reaching them and supporting them, as well as government agencies. For those who are displaced, there are also barriers to accessing aid. The humanitarian response overwhelmingly concentrates aid in centralized areas. Again, people with disabilities, it may not be able to reach those centralized points, either because they don't have support to get there, they may not have information. Aid that is being provided sometimes is not fit for purpose. This can be in the types of food and the nutritional requirements. We see many times in conflicts around the world that there can be a shipment of hospital wheelchairs. We all have an image of what that is in our mind, but these are essentially not usable actually by a person with a disability. A wheelchair must be fit to the person and meet their different physical and other requirements. So in terms of the way forward, the humanitarian response must be rights respecting. It must reach all of those, including those who are the most marginalized. We see increased recognition of persons with disabilities and their particular needs and the barriers for them to access aid and services, but this needs to be consistent and comprehensive. The most important aspect is really the active participation, leadership, and inclusion of people with disabilities, not only in the humanitarian response, but in documenting and participating in investigations of war crimes, justice mechanisms that we all hope and desire to happen. On the right here is an image of a man named Sashko. He has intellectual disabilities. He received glasses, which had been damaged and then lost by the conflict when he fled an area of active conflict, and he then subsequently became engaged in a humanitarian and human rights response. So I will stop there.